Now listen, as I said last night, my focus is ultimately what animates me in all of this is I am just so convinced that folks are going to be hugely encouraged to come to grips more carefully and deliberately and biblically with the real life that Jesus lived, to know that life as a narrative, as an actual human life. And so we're going to look at some of the background to Jesus' ministry, but I want to think about the nativity narrative this morning. And I said to you last night that it's so important, and you know this, to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. And it's a Jewish culture. The New Testament writers wrote in Greek, they thought in Hebrew. They lived Hebrew lives. And so this, by the way, is one of the reasons, and don't get me started here, but it's so important to know the Old Testament. It's such a, Walt Kaiser in his book on what's toward something, I can't remember what, no, it's toward rediscovering. I told him one time, is he ever going to write an untoward book? He writes all these books, toward this and toward that. Well, toward rediscovering the Old Testament. And he says in the first chapter that and I think he gives a percentage or something, 90%. By the way, 94.3% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Amen. Including that one right there. But the point is that but the point is that he offers some statistic, but he says the great majority of heresies which have infected the Christian church are a function of not knowing the Old Testament. If you bring the Old Testament with you in every way, I always tell people that wherever you are in the Bible, God expects you to bring with you everything He already said. So He wants you, He expects you to know the Old Testament as you try and understand the New Testament. So at any rate, the point is that culture, that culture is so important. And with regard to the nativity narrative, I am going to ask you delicately to recalibrate. We've got to be in obviously Matthew 1 and Luke 1 and 2, but I'd ask you to sort of consciously recalibrate your understanding of the nativity narrative. And I realize that that's kind of a dicey proposition because this is a pretty well-known and popular and blessed narrative and so on. But, in introducing his servant song in Isaiah 53, Isaiah begins with this remarkable statement. He says, "Who has believed our report?" And his point is, I believe, that having been taught since the garden to look and to look alone, that is, the only hope we have is this son of the seed of the woman who's going to be raised up by God to deliver us from the curse of sin. And through all of those centuries, having been taught to wait anxiously for this long-awaited Messiah, who would have believed that when He appears, there is no form nor comeliness that we should desire Him? And when we think about that passage, you know what, I don't even know, I'm going to shut that off. When we think about that passage, I think our mind goes intuitively, and I think appropriately, to the cross. I'd like to insist that our mind ought to go as well to the manger. That there is a level, a measure of ignominy and shame that shapes this story that would have leapt off the page to the first century Jewish reader. And we miss it because we think of the nativity narrative in terms of our culture. Does that make sense to you? So I'm going to identify, and I have on your notes there, 3 areas, specific elements of the story that I think we need to rethink. So let me go through it quickly. First of all, I say there concerning the relationship of Joseph and Mary at the time of the angelic announcement. And what I'm after here, if I go to Matthew chapter 1, is in Matthew 1 verse 18, it says, "The birth of Jesus Christ was as follows, after His mother was betrothed to Joseph." Now listen, honestly, in the first place, you'll know that there are translations. The early NASB, before they redid it, had the word engaged there. Mary was engaged to Joseph. The NIV still has pledged. What does it mean to be pledged? See, they're not man and wife. What you have to understand is that they were already legally man and wife. And there's more to it than that, because it goes on to say, and this is what would have just been so frankly shocking to a first century, after his mother was Mary was betrothed to Joseph before they came together. Now listen, I know many of you are familiar with this, but let me just walk you through it real quickly. The dynamics of Jewish weddings. And it's the same today in an Orthodox setting. And you know what, by the way, I would suggest, I think it's so important to learn this culture. It's a delightful culture, it's an accessible culture, but it's a culture which is in so many ways very different from our culture. And if there are two places where you ought to start, and I'm talking about studying, read books on the way it was in the Bible times, and get to Israel, for heaven's sakes. That's going to be a huge help. But two places where I really would, I encourage people all the time to start studying the culture is marriage and burial. Because on the one hand, those two elements of life show up so often in the record, either in word pictures or narratives, and so often. And on the other hand, the way they went about it is so different from what we know, so foreign. So let me take you to marriage. Now you know that in a Jewish marriage there were two steps. Number one was the betrothal. And the betrothal was the young woman and the young man would come together before a judge or an elder, someone with administrative authority. The families would be there. In most cases, there would be a contract, and they would agree to marry. In many cases, this may be the first time the young man and the young woman have met. Now, there was a great deal more input on the part of the young man. I mean, read the stories in the Bible and so on. But basically, these are arranged marriages, and I'm an old guy, and I'm not going to change it, but I think there's something to be said for it. So there. But as a matter of fact, I always say, if all the demons in hell took a whole weekend just to come up with a method of courtship, which was most certainly destructive, they'd come up with what we got, right? So I don't think we got any high ground to sit in judgment on it. But the fact is that they would come together, and in the betrothal, they would become, I always say, what does it take to break an engagement in our culture? That's how people think of it. They think they were engaged. And even because they don't even understand betrothal, if they've got a better word in the translation they're using, they'll still read engaged, because that's our culture. And what does it take to break an engagement? One bad date, right? You're out of here, bud. On the other hand, what does it take to break a betrothal? It takes a divorce, because they were legally man and wife. But as I say, there's more to it, because there followed the betrothal a set period of months. And by the way, and I realize there's some discussion about this, but I'm the only guy in the room with a microphone, so there I get to say what I say. But I'm convinced that, I think the evidence is clear from everything we know of the culture, that the date was set. Sometimes you'll hear that the date wasn't set, you had to wait till the last minute and so on, but that makes no sense, because number one, I'm going to tell you something. In this culture, when there's a wedding, a family wedding, you get there. I believe that Jesus, the reason he emerged from the wilderness after his temptation, I don't mean to go here, but you know, the first time Jesus had gone to be baptized of John, right? As he came up out of the waters, the Spirit of God drove him into the wilderness. He's there for 40 days. Now, during those 40 days, he eats nothing. What do you look like at the end of a 40-day fast? He's at the very brink of death. Now, I mean, physically, he's at such an extremity, it's hard to imagine. And you know, by the way, but there's such an interesting contrast there between the first Adam, where God deliberately surrounded him with every conceivable advantage, and the last Adam, where God deliberately reduced him to every conceivable disadvantage. Physically, nobody around, he's out there in the Jeshimon, but now the devil comes, pulls up the heavy artillery. Jesus, in fact, because, I didn't say this last night, but not only is it true that Jesus is in his life, because he took upon a real humanity in all of its parts, the fact is that during his life, Jesus, think about this, had no more spiritual resources than you and I. And he was every bit as dependent upon those spiritual resources. So when he is tempted of the devil, he hies himself to the Scriptures. Now, angels come. Such a huge thing. And I think that bespeaks the fact that Jesus, here's another reality from the life of Jesus, Jesus never uses his miracle working power on his own behalf. And I think if it were anybody else, Jesus might have simply spoken them into health. But he wouldn't do that because he came to live your life before you, and you can't do that. And yet Jesus was at such a physical extremity, he would have physically died if he hadn't had some help, and he was entirely alone. And so the first of 2 times in his life, the Father in heaven sends angels. And I think those angels did for Jesus what you and I would have done for him. Nursed him back to health over some weeks. But now the next time, as a matter of fact, I like to say that I think of Jesus, as it were, kissing his mother on the cheek there in Nazareth and saying, I'm going to go be baptized by John. I should be back in just a few weeks, few days. But he's been gone now. He went down a month and a half. He was fasting. And then the temptation, how long would it take to nurse him back to health, to where he could just get up and move about? I think some weeks, certainly. But now the next time Mary sees Jesus, after he, as it were, kissed her on the cheek, was when he comes to a wedding in Cana on the 5th day of his public ministry. It's all laid out for you in John 1. And the 5th day after he emerges from the wilderness, he makes it to that wedding. And again, I think what's at stake there is Jesus knew that was on his calendar. He knew his mother would be horrified, and it would be an offense if he didn't show up at that wedding. And I think there are elements of the story, I'm getting too deep into this, but I think there are elements of the story that would suggest that he's still, as a matter of fact, that he's still recovering from the effects of a 40-day fast. You have to factor that in, what you look like at the end of a 40-day fast. And now Jesus emerges from the wilderness, and now my imagination has officially gotten the best of me here. But I just wonder if maybe there weren't some of those angels who were saying to Jesus, are you sure you're ready for this? Are you sure you're ready? And I picture Jesus saying, I have to get to that wedding. I'm obligated. So I say that, and he does come to the wedding. And by the way, that's where you have that marvelous moment of leave-taking where Jesus so delicately and lovingly informs his mother that what she too would have been waiting for her son to actually commence this messianic ministry, to which she knew he was committed and so on. But there at the wedding, Jesus so lovingly informs Mary that things are going to be different, and he's not going to be able to be the full-time, dutiful son and care. You know, it doesn't mean anything to you. Maybe we'll talk about this. But for those 18 years, somewhere clearly between Luke 2 and Matthew 3, if you don't know that, is between Jesus in the temple at the age of 12, where Joseph is there. Somewhere between that and when Jesus went to be baptized, his father, Joseph, his adopted father, had died. And because there are any number of times in the Gospels when he encounters his family, and Joseph is never there. And then on the cross, of course, Jesus, as a loving, dutiful, caring son, turns his mother over to John. Clearly, Joseph is dead. When Joseph died, and we don't have any idea really when in that period of time, but when Joseph died, by the protocols of both Jewish culture and the moral principles of the Bible, Jesus would have, as the eldest son, would have stepped into the role of surrogate father, caring for his mother, going off day by day and doing the hard work of a stonemason. I think he probably apprenticed his younger brothers as stonemasons. I think very possibly Jesus was involved in arranging the marriages of his half-sibling sisters and his half-sisters and so on. Jesus knows what it is to care for a family. And one of the interesting dynamics here, how did I get here? But one of the, I think, really encouraging and interesting dynamics is that during the years of his public ministry, he never abandons that role. It's so fascinating that early on in his ministry, as a matter of fact, right after the wedding at Cana in John chapter 2, John 2 and verse 12, says that he took his family and went to Capernaum. He lived in Nazareth. Nazareth was a place horribly ill-suited as the center of an itinerant ministry in Galilee. And so he moves his family. This is a big deal for a family to leave the village of their youth. That was a big deal in those days. But Jesus takes his family and moves them to Capernaum. It's also in Matthew 4:13. Well, I used up my point. The thing is that he takes his family. He doesn't just move to Capernaum, he takes his family. And I think it's fair to say that Jesus knows full well what it is to balance the demands of a ministry with the demands of a family. Think about this. Jesus, I think, was responsible for the spiritual watch care of his family for we don't know how many years. And yet, John 7, verse 2, his own brothers did not believe in him. You think that broke Jesus' heart? You can bet it did. All right, but that's a whole nother issue. So I come way back to it. This is where I was starting. The fact is that weddings were hugely important in Jewish life, and you got to a wedding. And so I go back to it. This is what the wedding looked like. First of all, there was the betrothal. And at the betrothal, the young man and the young woman were and I know the point I was going to make earlier is that it doesn't make any sense that the date was general. Yeah, people were coming from places and so on. They would build their life around, they'd build their schedule. Now, there is, I'll tell you where that comes from, the idea. It's John 3 and then Jesus' parable of the young women who were watching with their lanterns, the 10 virgins. And, well, let me leave that alone. All right, let me come back to it, because I'm going to come back to that. Here's the point. First of all, you have the betrothal. And at the betrothal, there is the dowry is established and all the legal arrangements. And if there's going to be any sort of token, any sort of swapping of a token and so on, that happens at the betrothal. So now they're man and wife. But one element of the betrothal contract is the date of the wedding. And so during the period, and this is huge, this is what makes the picture so meaningful when Jesus so often uses marriage wedding imagery, because between the period between the betrothal and the wedding, both the bride and groom had a responsibility. The groom's responsibility was to prepare the house in which way they would live. Now let me say this. We take the leave in Leave and Cleave a little more seriously than they did, okay? You were going to, and I think then the Bible intends, quite frankly, I'm the grandparent. But the point is that when they married, they didn't, go off and get an apartment and get a job and, drive to see the folks on Christmas or whatever. The fact is that this is a clan. Here's another element of first century culture that's so important. They lived as clans. Your whole life was about your clan, your extended family. Even in the New Testament, they're more urbanized, and Rome, of course, is an overarching empire. But if somebody stole something, you didn't call 911. Nobody's answering that phone. You know what I'm saying? Everything was a function of the clan. And so when the young woman agreed to marry the young man, she was going to become part of that clan. And generally, as a matter of fact, one of the kind of expressions for getting married was adding a room to your daddy's tent. Some guys getting to be a little aged and say, it's about time to add a room to your daddy's tent, isn't it? Because that's what they do. Get some goat hair and put in that room back there. So the point is, and they would just move in. So they would be very much under the tutelage and the watch care of the clan and the parents and so on. But the point is that was the responsibility of the husband, of the groom, to prepare the place to which where they would live. And the responsibility of the bride was to make herself beautiful for her wedding day. Because on the wedding day, it was fairly simple. The groom would simply go to the home of the bride. There might be a bit of a family feast there, but then he would take her to the place that he had prepared. And it's called the wedding march sometimes. And But it was not that simple, because according to the wealth and so on of the families, there would be dancing there would be dancing girls. I'm not dancing girls, but there would be music, there would be poetry, there would be dancing girls, but there wouldn't be a long line kicking their feet up. But the point is that, honest to goodness, there would be, and it was absolutely forbidden not to make merry at a wedding. Remember the guy who was tossed out of the wedding feast because of a dull garment in Jesus' parable. So the point is that the bride and groom would make their way with their wedding party, and they would make their way through the streets, and the bride would be oftentimes held aloft on some sort of a chair, and she'd be all decked out in her finery and so on. And there would be people extemporizing poetry to her beauty and who knows what all. And they would make their way through, and if you encountered them, if you were just coming home from the grocery store and you encountered a wedding march, you didn't just stand there and watch. And by the way, when I'm in Israel, I contrive to be in Jerusalem either Monday or Thursday, because today it's with bar mitzvahs. And when there's a bar mitzvah going on, they love to have you join in and dance with them and get it on for a few minutes and so on. That's the way. And so with a wedding march, this is a silly, but do you remember wicked Queen Jezebel? Everybody remember Jezebel? Do you remember how she died? I always say this may be one of the Old Testament stories for which you will be hard-pressed to find a flannel graph, if you know what I'm saying. I love to... I've been using that line for years, and now the kids, they don't even know what a flannel graph is. They have no idea what I'm talking about. But the point is, the Bible says she was thrown down and eaten of dogs. But the dogs consumed all of her except the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet. And there is a Jewish midrash. You know what a midrash is? It's a homily, as it were. And there's a Jewish midrash on that passage that says this, that the reason that God spared her, as wicked as she was, when she encountered a wedding march, she danced and clapped her hands. And so God spared her. I don't know how advantaged she was by God's grace in that regard. But the point is, that's to that degree that a wedding is a time to make merry and to share in the delight and so on. And now they're going to come to the place where the wedding feast will commence. And the wedding feast is, by our standards, something of an open house. There's going to be a feast that night, and then for several days you'll come whenever you can and just congratulate and share the joy and so on. And this is why Mary is so concerned when they want wine at that family. Clearly that's a family wedding in John chapter 2. I've read where in the rabbinical records there were two families, with the son and daughter were getting married, and they ran out of wine, and the one family sued the other for damages, because it was such an embarrassment to run out of wine. And the issue being that it's got to be merriment and so on. So I come back to it. The point is that you know this, that on the night of the wedding feast, after they have this marvelous wedding march, and then they come together, there is a wedding feast, and the culmination of the wedding feast that night is that the bride and groom go into the bridal chamber. And forgive the indelicacy perhaps, but I think it's important to, purity, virginity, was so prized, biblically prized. They regarded it as so very, very important to maintain purity and so on, that when there was physical evidence of the young woman's virginity, they would pass the towel around the room. You're familiar with that. And they would rejoice over the fact that this young woman had kept herself pure for this, her wedding night. Now think about how all that plays into this business. You know what? Let me tell you something. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't so, I would have told you so. Now I am going to go away and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'm going to come back and receive you to myself. That's wedding talk. It's just shame that we can, and I'll tell you something. Now, nobody in the room is going to agree with me on this, okay? But I don't think that phrase, in my Father's house are many mansions, is a description of heaven. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he is saying is, this is in the upper room. Within hours, he's going to die. Judas has just left to fetch the Sanhedrin. I'm in John 14 all of a sudden. And Jesus is telling his disciples things they don't want to hear. And they're really just horribly chagrined about all this dying talk. And by the way, in the middle of my by the way, think about where we are. If you're one of those disciples, about 6 months ago, Jesus began for the very first time, he started talking to you about dying, and you were horrified, and you're just as horrified today as you were back then. But with all that dying talk, what you know is this. A few days ago, Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey, and the whole city welcomed him as king. Where's dying in that? This is looking really good. And then on Monday, he goes in and cleanses the temple and behaves more messianically than any other time in his whole life, controls the temple for 2 days. And again, I'm saying, you're thinking, you're one of the disciples, you're saying, we are on a roll here. This is good stuff. And now, on Thursday afternoon, Jesus had led them to a house that he had arranged for you know, it's very likely that many of those Galilean middle-class working type apostles, men, had never been in a house this nice. Normally they would have just had a pup tent on a hill somewhere and they'd have kept the Passover there. But no, Jesus takes them to a beautiful home in the gated community on the western hill with large upper room furnished for a feast. Again, I think if you're one of the apostles, you're thinking, man, it's coming. You know, and I think they really believed that Jesus was about to hand out kingdom assignments. And now he starts talking again about dying. They don't want to hear about dying. They don't understand this. And I think that's what he means when he says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe. See, I got to go back. My illustration, here's a clan, here's a clan. You got a young man, you've got a young woman. Somebody in this clan gets an eye for that young woman, maybe the young man, they deputize. And by the way, the guy they deputize is called a friend of the bridegroom because he knows the bridegroom better than anybody else. So he's going to come over here to this clan and make the deal and so on, work it through and so on. So the point is that as this clan, you've got a young woman in whom you've invested so much and you love her so dearly, and she's going to go off. You remember I said that your life is about clans, and you want that clan to grow. And there's only one way for that clan to grow, and that is to have babies. But that young woman is going to go and strengthen this clan. But the point is that as you contemplate, should we allow her to be wed to that young man in that clan, you're not thinking primarily about that young man. You're thinking about that clan. You're thinking about the leader of the clan. Is he effective? Has he proven himself over the years? Is that a prosperous, healthy clan? Does that make sense to you? That's really what's at stake. And I think when in Jesus, in John 14, what he's saying is this: you believe in God. You've learned to respect my Father, to trust my Father. I'm telling you, you can trust me. Just as if you can trust that patriarch, well, that young man will be fine. And then he says this: in my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't, I think what he is saying is, as it were, it's a word picture. My Father is the leader of a great clan. You can trust him. It's a great clan. And therefore, know this, that I'm going to go away and prepare a place for you. All right, now I lost my way. My point is simply, he's picking up. And this is why I say this marriage terminology, and not just terminology, but the picture just appears in the record so often. But you got to be able to think, frankly, and I don't mean to take too much of myself, but you got to be able to think from the terms of that culture in order to recognize them in any case. So I leave it alone. The point is that you have the wedding march, and then at the end of the wedding march, there is the feast, and it's a time of great rejoicing, and then there is the demonstration of purity and the great rejoicing and so on. Now, having said all that, let's go back to this picture. Matthew simply says to that culture that there was a young woman who was betrothed, so the legal arrangements had been taken care of and so on. After his mother was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child. So here's the story. Here you have these two families living up in Nazareth. They're both Judahites. That is the family of Mary. The family of Joseph have relocated. Now, about 100 years before Jesus, a Hasmonean prince took his army up there and annexed Galilee. And when you get to Israel, one of the most dramatic lessons to learn, I don't know, is the distinction between Galilee and Judea. Judea down there is, well, the rabbinical saying is that it's easier to grow 10 sons in Galilee than it is to grow one vineyard in Judea. And there's a lot of truth to that. Judea is tough living, tough traveling, tough water, little soil, tillable soil, plenty of water, but it's hard to trap, to keep, where Galilee is broad and huge, beautiful, beautiful hillsides, and the most, one area of Galilee, Josephus refers to, I love this phrase, and I know it's specifically of the plain of Gennesaret, but he calls, and I think it can be applied just almost as forcefully to all of Galilee, he calls it the ambition of nature. If nature could be what it wants to be, this is what it was. That's Galilee. So all of these Jews had moved up to Galilee, even though in this case their family was down there. But my point is that you have these two families, and the family of Joseph, the family of Mary, and those two clans have agreed that they will marry, and the message has gone out, the glad message. There's going to be a wedding. Young Mary and young Joseph are going to be married on such and such a date. They would have begun to make preparation and so on. Now, by the way, because, and you can imagine, this is not hard to imagine at all, once they were legally man and wife, the temptation to impurity would be stronger perhaps, and so in many cases the young woman would absent herself, and that's exactly what Mary does. She goes and spends those 3 months with Elizabeth down in the hill country of Judea. Now she returns to the home village of Nazareth, and we don't know, it doesn't say exactly, but sometime after she returns, the weeks are going by, and quite frankly, she's showing. She can't hide it anymore. And you know what, could I say this to you? I think Mary could do this calculation when the angel appeared to her. I think she knew she could easily, she knew what this was going to cost. But now time goes by, and she's discovered to be pregnant. Now, by the way, one of the, there is, you know this, you gentlemen especially, you've spent time with this, there is a world of unbelieving scholars, I guess we have to call them, who love to pick at the Bible and insist that it's full of contradictions. Frankly, their happy hunting ground is the Gospels, because you got 4 guys telling the same story. And furthermore, they insist that these 2 nativity narratives clearly represent 2 traditions, 2 sources, because they're so different and so absolutely irreconcilable. It's such, they fit together so perfectly. And they will very superficially say, in one gospel you've got an angel appearing to Mary, in another to Luke. Well, think about it. The angel does appear to Mary, to Luke. There are no angels appearing to Luke, to Joseph. What did I say? Mary and Joseph was what I'm trying to say. But the point is, the angel does appear to Mary. She consents. She rejoices. And now time goes by. She goes down to Elizabeth. She comes back. How is she going to break this news? And she's discovered to be pregnant. And you have this poignant story where right here, and I want you to see it. I was going to call it up, but let me just. In Matthew 1, it says that she was found with child of the Holy Spirit, and I'm in verse 19, Joseph, her husband, being a just man. Now that's quite simply a present participle, and it can be read in 2 very different ways, honestly. And the context, as is often the case, has to help you determine which. And I think it's normally read to say this, that Joseph, because he was a just man, decided not to put her, to shame her. But I think it would be better read, Joseph, in spite of the fact that he was a just man. I think what Matthew is saying is, Joseph had there was no carelessness on his part with regard to biblical standards. And he was a just man. And by what everything's, look, the only conclusion to which you can come is that Matthew has played the harlot. What in the world? Where am I? Mary has played the harlot. The Mary has been unfaithful. And that's an unspeakable wickedness. And so I think what Matthew is saying is that in spite of the fact, Matthew, being a just man, understand, he loved the Scriptures. He loved the law. He loved the standards of God. And he had discovered his wife to be carrying a child who was not his. And yet in spite of that, he determined not to shame her, to put her away publicly, to put her away privately. But while he is thinking on these things, now do you have your Bible open? Because I want to do a little experiment here. Matthew 1 and verse 20. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Now the point is that whereas the critics will insist that there's some sort of hopeless contradiction here, how could it be otherwise? The narrative is so perfect. Because on the one hand, that which is conceived in Mary is of the Holy Ghost. Look, don't rehearse any of them in your mind. But will we not all acknowledge that we have known this or that young lady who did wickedly and came up with a pretty bizarre story to cover her wickedness, right? Try this one on for a second. You know what I'm saying? Who is going to believe this? So there is no other way it can possibly be that now the angel comes and confronts Joseph. But look, if you will, in verse 20. Once again, while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord, eyeball the verse, appeared to him in a dream saying, and most of you have this in your mind. You can quote this. But in a dream saying, Joseph, son of David. Now here's what I want you to see. Do not be afraid to take to you Mary. What's the next word you got? Anybody got anything else? As. Don't you have as? Almost all the translations have as. Now, they used to put in italics. They've quit doing that. I think it's unfortunate that, the whole idea of acknowledging when they're adding it for what they think is to make sense of it. Folks, think about it. The as is not there in the Greek. And it changes everything. If the angel said to Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, what does that mean? It's not your wife. You're not married. No, they're married. But this is a Jewish culture. And I think this is one of the most poignant scenes in the entire narrative. Because what's at stake is this. Joseph, don't be afraid to take your wife. Go get her. Fetch her. Bring her to the place you prepared. There won't be any dancing. People will probably spit at you. You might want to do it under cover of night. Your family is going to be horrified. That's why he says, don't be afraid. Go get her. Bring her home. And I think it's such a poignant scene. Young Joseph, trusting God's revelation, goes and brings home this pregnant woman. Now listen, as I say, his family would have been horrified. This is such a shame. I'll just leave it at that. What's going on here? And again, let's go back. A few weeks, months ago, the message had gone out. Young Mary and young Joseph are to be wed. They're betrothed. Here's the date. Make preparation. Begin to figure out how you're going to be there for the wedding and so on. But now a few weeks go by and another message goes out. There's to be no wedding. Mary is carrying a child. It's clearly a child that she conceived before the wedding night. That never happened. Joseph insists it's not his child. She has some crazy story. But it's almost, look, our culture has become totally accustomed to the idea of women bearing children outside of marriage. And I know it gets close to home sometime. My oldest granddaughter was conceived, and by the way, we spent about 10 years trying to put that toothpaste back in the tube, let me tell you. And I tell people all the time that daughter who got pregnant with Isabel is God's way of teaching me to treasure the verse in Joel 2 that says God knows how to buy back the years the locust ate, because she is living, oh my goodness. But the point is that in that culture, for a woman to bear that child, to be pregnant with that child, and then for her betrothed husband to go and to bring her home. Now, you don't have to, with all the time I spent explaining it, none of that's necessary in the first century. As soon as they read, she was betrothed to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit. You know, she was found to be with child, everybody's going to go, oh. And so my point is that when you understand what's at stake here, the betrothal, and what jumps off the page by that simple narrative description, you understand that there is a measure of ignominy and shame and anger and embarrassment that is huge. And let me take you to the second point there, and this is kind of pedantic, forgive me, I specialize in pedantry, but my second point, so I'm saying recalibrate your head at this point that number one, they weren't engaged, they were betrothed, and all that is involved in that particular area of Hebrew life and culture is going to play into that simple statement. After she was betrothed, before they came together, she was found with child. That's huge. But a second way in which I'd ask you to kind of recalibrate your mind is this, that this is going to seem kind of not unimportant, but it really is important, I think. Mary and Joseph were not making a quick trip to Bethlehem to register for a tax roll. They were moving to Bethlehem. They were moving back to Bethlehem. Now, I know that this, gets in the way of a lot of, Christmas stories and so on, but here, I'll be very, very quick. Number one, Luke puts the trip to Bethlehem, he relates it to the census. He says there is a decree that went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and that included Judea, and so everybody had to go back. And then the next verse says, so Joseph had to go, and he took Mary. And so we get the idea that he was just making that quick trip because he had to register. As a matter of fact, it gets more and more complicated because then you're told that, well, the reason when he got there was no place in the Motel 6 was because everybody had to be in town to register. Well, look, there's a lot about this registration, the whole census thing in Luke 2, that it's a little difficult, but let me tell you something. We read it sometimes as if Joseph had gotten a postcard and it said, Bethlehem, City Hall, 10 o'clock, Tuesday morning, October 3rd, be there. Oh no, the baby is coming, I gotta go. That's not the way it worked, for heaven's sakes. They had months, usually a year. Somewhere within a year, you had to come and register. That makes sense to you? So, and so you don't have everybody showing up because there's one day of registration or something like that. Number two, well, I'll just say that there are several indications. Number one, that Mary, here's where I'm taking you. Mary and Joseph had decided their roots were not in Nazareth. Now their family had been there for at least one, maybe two generations, so they had some roots, but their family home was Judah, Bethlehem. And I will argue that they were clearly moving to Bethlehem. They were going to relocate, which is a big deal. Here are my arguments. Number one, he took Mary. Now, everybody who has tries to argue for the idea they were making a quick trip has to deal with the question, why would he take his very pregnant, she may not have been quite that pregnant, but she was pregnant, clearly. Why would he take his very pregnant wife along? And you'll have all sorts of crazy explanations. There is no explanation. If all he had to do was go down there and register, there was absolutely no reason to take his pregnant wife along. All right, so number one. But number two, this is big. After the baby is born, you have the whole Egypt story. Herod tries to kill the baby, and therefore they flee to Egypt. Now, when the angel comes and says, all right, Herod is dead, what does the Bible say? It says they returned. Actually, this is interesting. It says they turned to the land of Israel. They're in Egypt, so they returned to the land of Israel. And they stayed there until they heard that Archelaus was going to reign. And then, and Matthew gives us that strange, in order that might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene, they moved to Nazareth. So the only reason they moved to clearly, Archelaus was the governor of Judea. So clearly they had intended to settle in Judea, right? And it was only when they heard that Archelaus was on the throne, was going to succeed his father Herod the Great, that they decide, in point of fact, to move back to Nazareth. So I think the evidence is quite clear in the narrative that they were not just making a quick trip. they had decided to move back to Bethlehem. Now, I don't think that's conjecture. I think the Bible is quite clear about that. It doesn't make sense to say that they were just making a quick trip, because clearly they were going to settle. When they came back from Egypt, they were going to settle in Judea. And that would have been Bethlehem. Here's the conjecture. Why, at this point in their young married life, do they decide to relocate to Bethlehem? And I think almost certainly it was because life had become so unlivable in the little village of Nazareth. You know, Joseph, I said to you before, and I love carpentry. I'm not good at it, but I watch, Norm Abrams reruns. You know what I'm saying? I say Norm Abrams is my second favorite Jewish carpenter. I don't even know for sure if he's Jewish, but anyway, my point is, maybe you don't know Norm Abrams, but the point is, as I said last night, there just isn't wood. You don't build with wood in Israel. And I would argue that quite clearly. And the word tekton, Joseph is identified as a tekton, and the word means builder. It means craftsman or artificer, but it really means builder. And so I think almost certainly Jesus was a stonemason. And by the way, working with heavy stones all of his life, it says something about his virility that he was able to survive a 40-day fast, that he was able to survive a heaviness that caused his the sweats of blood in Gethsemane, the drops of blood and so on. That bespeaks a really, really strong, virile man. And I think that's what you get when but my point is that all work in that day was day work. All the work you had, you just went and signed on with a supervisor or a foreman, and you agreed to build this wall or whatever, and you worked at it for a day. At the end of the day, you got a day's wage, and you took it home. And I think it's helpful, if not certain, to conceive of Jesus and, first of all, Joseph, as probably working at a city called Sepphoris, just about 3 miles north of Nazareth. And it was a place where they were putting a lot of money into it. Herod was, first of all, Herod the Great, and then Herod Antipas. So the point is, here's this growing city, here's this little agricultural village called Nazareth, and I think the routine was very possibly, whether it was Sepphoris or somewhere else, the routine would be that early in the day, well before the sun was up, you'd pack a lunch and you'd make your way off to the work site, and you'd sign on with a supervisor, and you would work through the day, and that night you'd get the day's wage, and you'd come home. But the thing is, you would almost in every case, if you were any sort of an artificer or any sort of a craftsman, you'd do that with a work crew, a work gang. And so you'd have them in from your neighborhood, and you'd learn to work together and so on. Now here's where I'm taking it. I think almost certainly whoever Joseph's work crew was said, Joseph, you're not working with us anymore. You brought home a woman who is bearing a child who is not yours. You've made her your wife. You're bringing this embarrassment on your family. You're not welcome to work with us anymore. My point is, I think in just so many ways, it probably had become unlivable to live in Nazareth. And so Joseph and Mary said, let's just go back home. Let's go back, there's work there, and we'll find a place where we'll be received. So I would say, number one, don't think of Mary and Joseph as engaged. They're betrothed, and that whole cultural construct plays into that. Number two, I don't think they were making a quick trip to Bethlehem. They were going to move there. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute. But then there's the big one, and go to Luke 2 and verse 6. And this is so confusing. Number one, there is this notion that, and it's ubiquitous, it's a given in this narrative, but it's wrong. It's biblically clearly wrong. There is this notion that Mary and Joseph got to town just in time for the baby to be born. And that all because of the census, all the Motel 6s were filled up. So finally they had to stay in a place where animals were kept. Well, in Luke 2, number one, in verse 6, it says explicitly that they came to Bethlehem. And look at verse 6. So it was that while they were there in Bethlehem, the days were fulfilled that were completed for her to be delivered. So clearly they're in Bethlehem for some days or weeks before the baby's born. That's why I say she's not imminently pregnant. I mean, she's not about to bear the child. When they arrive, they're there for some time. But the real complicating factor is in the next verse, where it says in verse 7, and she brought forth her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger, an animal's feeding trough. And that's the only hint that Jesus was born in a place where normally animals were kept, because he was laid in a manger. And then it says, she laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now this is the point. The word here is kataluma. It's used 2 other times in the New Testament. Both times it's a reference to the room to which Jesus took his disciples for the Last Supper. It means upper room. And this idea, now there are those who would disagree strongly with me here, but I don't think that the idea of a public hostelry, an inn like where you could get a room for the night, even existed in first century Judaism. Now there were these installations called caravansaries, or khans, which were small fortifications halfway between 2 cities where the caravans would stay. It was dangerous to stay in the open, so you'd have these khans. And some people make this a khan, but you don't have a khan inside of a city. A khan is on the road. This is where the Samaritan took the man, who fell among thieves, took him to the inn halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho. So those you have, but regardless of whether or not there were inns in the first century, and there are debates about this, especially in Israel, because Israel honored this biblical principle of hospitality. And hospitality doesn't mean just inviting people over for pie after the Sunday evening service. Go ahead, that's a fine thing. But we're talking about caring for people who are traveling, who are homeless or whatever, taking them in. And it was an absolute responsibility. And so the point is that when Joseph got to Bethlehem, where his family was, he would have gone to his family. Now, why do we have the word inn? Well, in every Jewish home, and this is true all throughout antiquity, the roof was a primary living space. I mean, you built your house so you could live on the roof. Now, you could do things on the roof. And one of the uses to which the roof was put was, in almost every case, there'd be some sort of a guest chamber. It might be entirely humble. It might be just some sort of a covering with an animal skin you could pull down when you slept and so on, but it was just a place and it was the place of honor. And so I think the point is, and by the way, you can read this verse, Luke 2 and verse 7. There was no topos for them in the kataluma. It can just as well be read, the kataluma was no place for them. I think the point is this. I'll cut to the chase, and with this I'm done. I think probably what happened is this, that I go way back, that Mary and Joseph were betrothed. She came home from Judea. She was discovered to be with child. There was such a sense of outrage and embarrassment, and yet the angel came to Joseph and said, look, go get her, bring her to the place you prepared. He does that. There's such anger, there's such embarrassment that life becomes very difficult in Nazareth. And this young couple makes a hard decision. Let's just move to Bethlehem. Let's go back to our family. So they do. There's a registry. I think this is the point, by the way. I think Joseph is saying to himself, I got to go down there anyway to register. So it's kind of a big deal. Why don't we just move down there? And I think that's the connection to the registration. He has to go down there anyway, but they're moving down there to stay. When they get there, they certainly would have gone to Joseph, to their family, but primarily Joseph's family. And I picture Joseph's family, somebody, maybe some near relative, and I picture him saying, Joseph, we love you. We're going to learn to love this woman you've taken as your wife. But she's carrying a child, which was conceived before the wedding night. It's not even your child. We can't give you the place of honor. The kataluma is not a place for you. Now we have a cave, and I think without a doubt Jesus was born in a cave, okay. And all the records of that. And in many cases where you have a homestead, you would have very close to the home, you would have a cave, and it was a man-made cave. You had chisel. Maybe you're going to build a wall. And you say, all right, We'll cut the ashlars, the small building blocks, out of the side of this good strain of limestone. But as we do, we'll leave behind a usable space. In this case, a pen for animals. So we have a small opening, and it can be easily closed. And somewhere as you dig out the limestone building blocks, you're going to leave a small pillar right in the middle, maybe a couple of them in the space, and just a pillar still attached to the earth. And you're going to carve out the top of that, and that's going to become a manger. And so I think very possibly Joseph's family says, Joseph, we can't give you the place of honor, but we can put the animals to pasture, and you can have this cave, and for who knows how many days and weeks, Mary and Joseph and people, this is a tiny village. Nazareth is a farming village, unwalled, everybody knows everybody. And so they would have seen young Mary and young Joseph living in that cave. And I wonder how many times Joseph had maybe gotten a pail of water and cleared all the gunk out of that feeding trough and scrubbed it down as well as he could, and taken some fresh grass and laid it in there to make it soft. And now the baby is born, and this is what's remarkable. You remember that the angels appear to the shepherds. You know this. And they tell the shepherds that the Christ child is born. There's such rejoicing. And the angel says, this will be a sign to you. You'll find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes. Now that's not the sign. Every Jewish baby was wrapped in swaddling clothes. You'll find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. Now think about that. Why is that the sign? Why can the angels be confident that when you find the baby lying in a manger, you'll have the right baby? Because you don't do that to a human baby. There won't be other babies lying in a feeding trough. And yet that's where Jesus was laid when he was born. And there is as I say, there is a level of shame and ignominy absolutely attached to that story that we often miss. And that's why I say, I think when Isaiah says, who can believe what I'm about to tell you? When this one whom we have longed for, we have been taught to long for all of these hundreds and thousands of years, when he comes, there will be no form nor comeliness that we should desire him. And as a baby, he'll be laid in an animal's feeding trough. I'll tell you, Paul exults over the fact that Jesus was willing to set aside the glory that was due him in becoming man. And I say, again, you see it most dramatically in the cross, but I think it's here in the manger scene. Now, let me address one other thing, and then I am genuinely done. But they are going to return to Nazareth. And I've had people say, well, if they in fact left Nazareth because life was so difficult, why'd they go back to Nazareth? All right, think about it in terms of that culture. Number one, they didn't have many choices. You lived with your family. And they had family in Nazareth, they had family in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was going to be ruled by Archelaus. Archelaus is a butcher worse than his father Herod. And the angel tells him, you got to get out of here. Where are they going to go? So they go back to Nazareth. I think there's another dynamic here, and this is kind of personal to me, but forgive me for it. But, you know, I mentioned to you before, and God has been so good to us. And we got 3 kids, and actually the booklet says 7. We got 9 grandchildren and 1 coming on the way, and in November. And our kids all love the Lord. But I'm not writing any books. Let me just tell you something on child rearing. I mean, there were some adventures along the way. And when my daughter, Kia, got pregnant and just sent our lives, I mean, that's what we had to give our attention to for 10 years to really bring that thing back. God honored, I mean to tell you. And I have never in my life been so thoroughly conflicted. And I don't even think about my emotions, but I was thinking about them. Because on the one hand, there is this excitement, your first grandchild's about to be born, and my daughter had repented, she was living with us, and we were making ready the nursery. And so there's a great deal of excitement. On the other hand, I just was so desperate that the reality of the wickedness not be overlooked. How do you factor that in? How do you measure? And I'm so torn into until the baby was born. Oh, forgive me. There's no conflict anymore. You just love on that baby. I don't know. Forgive me for getting maudlin here. But I think you have some of the same thing. You know, when Mary and Joseph come back and they have this baby in their arms and so on, and it's their family up there, and so you're gonna learn to embrace that family pretty quickly. So it's not incongruous to me that they did in fact go back to Nazareth, and clearly they did. But I come back where I started. I think it's so desperately important to understand these stories in terms of their own culture. I think this is a good illustration of it. But when you understand this blessed narrative in terms of its own culture, like I say, I think it's so important to understand, even as who doesn't love a newborn baby? And yet, that baby was the object of such anger and shame and embarrassment. It was a pure story in all of its parts. But I think that sets the scene for the life he's going to live and the death he's going to die. That makes sense? All right, thank you. Let me have a word of prayer with you. Father.